Ed Gein, often referred to as the Butcher of Plainfield, remains one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history. His story is chilling, not only for the crimes he committed but also for the complex psychological, social, and cultural factors that shaped his life. While his actions were extreme, examining his life through a factual lens helps illuminate broader questions about human behavior, trauma, and societal influence. This is not a story for sensationalism. It is a story that demands reflection and understanding of the factors that contribute to tragic and violent outcomes. Before we dive deeper, I want to take a moment to connect with you. If you enjoy detailed explorations like this and want to join a community where we examine history, psychology, and criminal behavior thoughtfully, consider subscribing to the channel. Liking this video helps me continue creating content, and in the comments, let me know where you're watching from and which cases you'd like me to cover next. Your engagement genuinely shapes the conversation and the content we explore together. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, to George and Augusta Gein. His early life was marked by isolation, hardship, and a strict, often toxic family environment. George Gein was described as a heavy drinker and a largely absent figure, leaving Augusta to exercise an overbearing control over her children. Augusta's influence on Ed cannot be overstated. She was deeply religious, imposing rigid moral codes and extreme views about sin, sexuality, and women. She presented the world in stark terms. Women were either pure and saintly or corrupt and sinful, a binary worldview that profoundly affected Ed's perceptions of human behavior. Ed had a difficult childhood with limited social interactions outside the family. He was closely bonded with his mother, Augusta, who instilled in him an obsessive focus on religious morality and fear of female sexuality. His father's neglect and his mother's domineering presence created an environment where Ed grew up isolated, with few opportunities to develop normal social relationships or experience emotional stability. His early life was punctuated by the deaths of several family members, including a brother and sister, events that further contributed to his sense of loss, detachment, and emotional instability. The social isolation Gein experienced was compounded by his education and early experiences in the community. He attended school sporadically and struggled to form friendships. By his teenage years, he had already begun showing signs of psychological disturbance, exhibiting odd behaviors and fixating on morbid subjects. While there were occasional interactions with the broader community, his relationship with his mother remained dominant, reinforcing her rigid beliefs and limiting his exposure to normal social development. Experts studying his case suggest that this combination of isolation, control, and trauma contributed to the later manifestation of his extreme behaviors. After his father's death in 1940 and his brother Henry's death shortly thereafter, Ed lived almost entirely under his mother's influence. By the time Augusta Gein died in 1945, Ed was already an adult, but her absence left him unprepared to navigate the world independently. He inherited the family farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, which became both his home and the site of his increasingly disturbing activities. Alone and socially isolated, Gein's behaviors grew more erratic. He began exhibiting compulsive tendencies, obsessing over his mother's teachings, and internalizing her extreme beliefs about women, sexuality, and morality. His farm, removed from neighbors and public scrutiny, became a space where he could act on impulses without immediate consequence. In the years following his mother's death, Gein's fascination with death and the human body deepened. He began to dig up corpses from local cemeteries, collecting human remains for reasons that experts interpret as attempts to reconnect with his mother or to embody aspects of women he both revered and feared. Gein's compulsions were complex, mixing grief, psychological disturbance, and an obsession with the maternal figure. These behaviors escalated over time, and his activities went largely unnoticed due to the farm's isolated location and the rural community's limited oversight. Psychologists analyzing Gein's behavior note that he displayed signs consistent with multiple psychological disorders, including schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and paraphilic disorders. His actions were driven by compulsions and distorted beliefs, making him both dangerous and deeply troubled. Importantly, experts emphasize that while his crimes were abhorrent, understanding the underlying psychological mechanisms provides insight into prevention, intervention, and treatment for individuals with severe pathology. By examining the factors that shaped his life, we gain a clearer perspective on how extreme isolation, trauma, and untreated mental illness can culminate in destructive behavior. The community around Plainfield, Wisconsin, remained largely unaware of the full extent of Gein's activities for decades. He was known to be an odd recluse, a figure of local gossip and curiosity, but no one suspected the depth of his compulsions. This lack of awareness highlights the challenges rural communities faced in identifying and intervening with individuals exhibiting extreme psychological disturbances. Gein's case underscores the importance of community vigilance, mental health awareness, and the need for systems capable of monitoring at-risk individuals before behaviors escalate. It wasn't until 1957, with the disappearance of local hardware store owner Bernice Wardens, that the extent of Gein's activities began to surface. The investigation into her disappearance led law enforcement to Gein's farm, where authorities discovered evidence of grave robbery and possession of human remains. The shock of these discoveries reverberated nationwide, as the case revealed not only the horrific acts themselves but also the psychological complexity behind them. Investigators found an assortment of items made from human skin, bones, and other materials, illustrating the depth of Gein's compulsions and his attempts to create a symbolic, almost ritualistic connection to his mother and deceased individuals. Ed Gein's arrest and subsequent trial brought attention to questions about criminal responsibility, mental illness, and the legal system's ability to handle extreme cases. Psychiatrists evaluated him extensively, and it became clear that while he was undoubtedly capable of criminal intent, his psychological disorders heavily influenced his behavior. This led to a verdict that recognized his insanity, resulting in his confinement to a mental institution rather than a traditional prison sentence. His trial highlighted the tension between understanding pathological behavior and ensuring public safety, and it remains a landmark case in forensic psychology and legal history. Culturally, Gein's life had an impact that extended far beyond Plainfield. His story inspired fictional characters and narratives in literature and film, including the creation of horror icons such as Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. While these adaptations are fictionalized and dramatized, they reflect society's attempt to grapple with the reality of extreme criminal behavior through storytelling, offering a mediated way to confront fear, horror, and the psychological mechanisms of deviance. Reflecting on Ed Gein's life, it is clear that his story is not solely about the crimes he committed, but also about the failures and complexities of the systems surrounding him. His upbringing, psychological development, social isolation, and lack of intervention created conditions for his compulsive and destructive behavior. Scholars, psychologists, and legal professionals continue to study his life to extract lessons about prevention, mental health support, forensic investigation, and societal responsibility. Gein's life demonstrates the profound consequences of neglect, trauma, and untreated pathology, offering insights that extend far beyond the specifics of his case. Understanding Ed Gein is both unsettling and instructive. His life challenges us to consider how early experiences shape behavior, how isolation can exacerbate pathology, and how communities and institutions can intervene before extreme behaviors emerge. While his crimes were horrifying, studying them provides an opportunity to reflect on human behavior, societal responsibility, and the role of mental health care in preventing future tragedies. By examining his life comprehensively, we gain insight into the broader dynamics that can lead to destructive outcomes and the ethical, legal, and psychological frameworks necessary to respond effectively. Ed Gein's story is a complex intersection of psychology, social environment, and criminality. His early experiences, compulsions, and the eventual uncovering of his crimes illustrate the profound consequences of trauma and isolation left unaddressed. For scholars, law enforcement, and the public, Gein's life offers lessons in prevention, intervention, and the understanding of extreme pathology. While his actions are horrifying, the ongoing study of his life contributes to a more informed approach to criminal psychology, The discovery of Ed Gein's crimes in 1957 sent shockwaves through Plainfield, Wisconsin, and soon the entire nation. For decades, Gein had lived in relative isolation on his family farm, blending into the background as a reclusive, odd man. The disappearance of Bernice Wardens, a 58-year-old hardware store owner, prompted a police investigation that would unearth horrors previously only whispered about in local gossip. What authorities found was beyond what anyone in the community had imagined, revealing not only criminal acts but a deeply disturbed psyche that challenged notions of morality, mental health, and human behavior. When police entered Gein's home, they were met with a scene that seemed more like a macabre museum than a residence. The farmhouse, which had once been a functional, if modest, family home, was cluttered with objects crafted from human remains. Skulls were repurposed as bowls, skin was fashioned into clothing, and bones were used for various implements. Each item seemed to represent a distorted ritual, reflecting both Gein's obsession with his mother and his need to recreate a sense of control over death and femininity. While these objects were shocking in their physicality, they were also symbolic, offering a window into a mind shaped by trauma, isolation, and pathological compulsion. Investigators quickly realized that Gein's activities were not limited to a single instance. His compulsions had spanned years, with grave robberies occurring in local cemeteries and artifacts collected from the bodies of recently deceased women. While his actions were grotesque, they were carried out with a level of organization that reflected a careful, ritualistic mindset. Law enforcement officials noted that Gein exhibited meticulousness in his handling of the remains, suggesting both obsession and an internal logic to his behavior that, while incomprehensible to outsiders, was deeply meaningful to him. The psychological evaluation of Ed Gein began almost immediately after his arrest. Experts noted that his behaviors were symptomatic of severe mental illness, including schizophrenia and paraphilic disorders. His compulsions were intertwined with delusions rooted in his upbringing, particularly the overbearing influence of his mother. Psychologists hypothesized that his grave robbing and creation of items from human remains were an attempt to reconnect with the maternal figure he had both revered and feared. Each action was a twisted manifestation of a longing for connection and control, filtered through a mind incapable of distinguishing between reality and compulsion. The investigation into Bernice Warden's disappearance provided the critical evidence needed to confirm the extent of Gein's crimes. Authorities traced the circumstances of her last known whereabouts, uncovering connections to his property. When they finally searched the barn and other outbuildings, the evidence left little doubt of his involvement. Gein confessed to killing Wardens and to a series of grave robberies that had spanned years. While he admitted to the murders of other individuals, investigators found varying levels of corroboration. His statements revealed a man driven by compulsions that were both sexual and morbidly ritualistic, reflecting an extreme blend of psychological pathology and a lack of ethical constraint. The community reacted with shock and disbelief. Plainfield, a small rural town, had long considered itself insulated from the kind of criminality seen in urban centers. The revelation that a neighbor, an otherwise unremarkable man, could commit such atrocities prompted questions about how mental illness is identified and managed, the role of isolation in fostering pathological behavior, and the limitations of social oversight in small communities. Residents struggled to reconcile their previous perception of Gein as a quiet recluse with the reality of his actions, highlighting how appearances can mask profound disturbances. During the trial, which commenced in 1958, the legal proceedings focused heavily on Gein's mental state. Psychiatrists testified regarding his history of trauma, compulsive behaviors, and detachment from reality. The central question was whether he understood the nature of his crimes and whether he could be held criminally responsible. Gein's behaviors clearly demonstrated planning and intent, yet his psychological disorders complicated the question of culpability. The legal system faced the difficult task of balancing public safety, accountability, and the recognition that Gein's actions were rooted in severe mental pathology. Ultimately, the court found Ed Gein unfit for traditional imprisonment and confined him to a mental institution, where he would spend the remainder of his life. His confinement was not only a matter of public safety but also a recognition of the complex interplay between his compulsions and his inability to function within society. At the institution, Gein became an object of study for psychologists and criminologists seeking to understand the depths of his pathology. His case contributed to the evolving field of forensic psychology, particularly in understanding the role of trauma, isolation, and mental illness in extreme criminal behavior. Ed Gein's crimes and subsequent confinement had a lasting impact on both criminology and popular culture. Writers and filmmakers drew inspiration from the grotesque aspects of his life, transforming elements of his story into fictionalized characters that explored themes of fear, identity, and the human psyche. Characters such as Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs are directly linked to Gein's actions, though dramatized for narrative purposes. While these adaptations are fictional, they reflect society's attempt to understand and process the reality of extreme criminal behavior through art and storytelling. However, it is important to remember that beyond the sensational aspects, Gein's story is rooted in real human suffering. His victims were real individuals whose lives were ended or violated by his actions, and their families endured profound trauma. Discussions of Gein's life, therefore, must maintain a focus on respect for those affected, contextualizing his pathology without excusing it. The study of his behavior provides insight into the warning signs, social failures, and psychological mechanisms that can contribute to extreme criminality, serving as a basis for prevention and intervention in future cases. Gein's story also serves as a cautionary tale regarding the dangers of social isolation and unaddressed mental illness. His life demonstrates how prolonged isolation, coupled with untreated psychological disorders, can escalate into compulsive and destructive behaviors. By examining the environmental, familial, and psychological factors that contributed to his actions, society gains a better understanding of how similar tragedies might be prevented through early intervention, community engagement, and mental health support. Even decades later, Ed Gein remains a figure of fascination, not simply for the horror of his actions but for what his life reveals about human psychology and societal responsibility. His case is studied in criminal psychology courses, law enforcement training, and legal ethics discussions, emphasizing the multifaceted lessons embedded in his story. These lessons highlight the importance of understanding the root causes of criminal behavior, the ethical obligations of society to intervene when warning signs appear, and the necessity of balancing compassion with accountability. In reflecting on Ed Gein's life, one sees a tragic convergence of psychological pathology, environmental factors, and systemic failure. His childhood trauma, intense maternal influence, social isolation, and escalating compulsions created conditions for extreme behavior that went unchecked for years. While the discovery of his crimes was shocking, it also prompted necessary examination of how communities, mental health professionals, and the legal system respond to individuals with profound psychological disturbances. In studying Gein, society confronts the uncomfortable truth that neglect, isolation, and untreated mental illness can result in consequences that affect both individuals and communities. Ed Gein's legacy is complex. He is remembered as a criminal whose actions were abhorrent, yet his life provides enduring lessons about the interplay of trauma, mental illness, and social responsibility. His story informs discussions about criminal justice, mental health policy, forensic psychology, and the ethics of cultural representation. By examining his life carefully, society can better recognize the warning signs of extreme pathology, develop strategies for intervention, and promote a more informed understanding of human behavior in its most extreme forms. Ed Gein's story illustrates the escalation of his criminal behavior, the investigation that brought him to justice, and the psychological and societal context that shaped his actions. While the events themselves are disturbing, understanding the factors behind them provides critical insight into the prevention and management of extreme criminal behavior. Gein's life is a reminder of the importance of early intervention, community awareness, and the ethical responsibility to address mental illness before it manifests in destructive ways. Following Ed Gein's arrest and the shocking revelations about his crimes, his life took a new trajectory: confinement in a mental institution. This phase of his story was marked by both public fascination and careful study by professionals seeking to understand the depths of his psychological disturbance. Gein was moved to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he would remain for the rest of his life. While his crimes had been grotesque, his time in confinement brought to light the complexity of his mental state, the influence of his upbringing, and the limitations of mid-20th century psychiatric treatment. Upon arrival at the hospital, Gein was subjected to a series of psychological evaluations designed to assess his mental health, cognitive function, and potential for rehabilitation. Psychiatrists noted that he exhibited clear signs of severe mental illness. He displayed compulsions rooted in his obsession with his mother, an inability to form normal social bonds, and a fixation on death and human remains. Diagnoses varied, but many professionals concluded that Gein suffered from schizophrenia or related psychotic disorders, compounded by paraphilic tendencies. His compulsions were ritualistic, often involving elaborate fantasies and behaviors that mirrored his distorted understanding of familial and societal relationships. Life at the hospital was highly structured, providing Gein with routines and supervision designed to minimize risk to himself and others. He was assigned chores, allowed limited social interaction, and participated in therapeutic activities, although the concept of therapy at the time was very different from contemporary practices. While some patients responded positively to structured treatment, Gein's deeply ingrained psychological patterns made meaningful rehabilitation difficult. His compulsions and morbid fantasies remained persistent, though his isolation and supervision prevented further criminal acts. During his time at the institution, Gein became a subject of fascination for both professionals and the public. Psychologists and criminologists were particularly interested in understanding the origins of his behavior. They analyzed his early life experiences, including his traumatic upbringing, domineering mother, and social isolation, as well as the factors that may have contributed to his compulsions. These studies sought to answer fundamental questions. How does prolonged trauma shape behavior? How does isolation exacerbate pre-existing psychological conditions? And how can society intervene effectively to prevent similar outcomes? Gein's case became a pivotal example in forensic psychology, illustrating the interplay between childhood trauma, mental illness, and criminal behavior. Despite the intensity of his psychological evaluation, the hospital staff treated Gein with a degree of professionalism and consistency. His daily life was carefully monitored, and he was kept away from situations where he could act on compulsive impulses. While some visitors and professionals reported that he could be cooperative and even personable in conversation, he also exhibited disturbing tendencies, such as fascination with his own past crimes and a continued preoccupation with death. These behaviors underscored the depth of his pathology and the challenges inherent in treating individuals with complex psychiatric and criminal profiles. Gein's confinement also raised ethical questions about the balance between treatment and punishment. While he was not placed in a traditional prison due to his mental state, the public demanded justice for his victims. The psychiatric system had to navigate these competing pressures, ensuring public safety, providing care for a mentally ill individual, and addressing societal expectations of accountability. The case highlighted the difficulties in managing individuals whose mental illness intersects with violent behavior, a challenge that remains relevant in modern forensic psychiatry. During this period, Gein's notoriety continued to grow, fueled in part by media coverage and public curiosity. While the details of his crimes were horrifying, they also captivated the imagination, leading to widespread discussion about criminal psychology and the nature of evil. Writers, journalists, and researchers examined not only his actions but also the societal and psychological conditions that had enabled them. The fascination with Gein's life reflects a broader cultural interest in understanding extreme human behavior and the factors that can lead ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary crimes. His time in the institution was marked by a relatively quiet existence, though it was punctuated by interactions with mental health professionals, journalists, and occasionally the legal system. Gein was evaluated multiple times to determine his competence, his risk to society, and the possibility of reintegration, though the consensus was that he would remain a lifelong patient. While the structured environment of the hospital prevented further harm, it also offered little opportunity for meaningful personal growth or emotional development. Gein's life became emblematic of the challenges faced by individuals who are both criminally dangerous and profoundly mentally ill. The examination of Gein's life in confinement provides insight into the ways psychiatric institutions of the mid-20th century approached extreme cases. Treatment often focused on containment, observation, and limited therapy rather than comprehensive rehabilitation. Gein's compulsions were deeply rooted, and contemporary interventions might have included cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed care, and intensive psychiatric management, approaches that were less available during his lifetime. His case, therefore, serves as a historical lesson in the evolution of mental health care, highlighting both the achievements and limitations of psychiatric practice during that era. Gein's notoriety extended beyond professional circles. Authors and filmmakers found inspiration in his story, transforming elements of his life into fictionalized narratives that explored fear, identity, and morality. Characters like Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs drew from aspects of Gein's behavior, his relationship with his mother, and his morbid fascination with death. These portrayals, while dramatized, reflect society's attempt to process the reality of human deviance and confront the psychological mechanisms underlying extreme criminal behavior. At the same time, discussions about Gein's life emphasize the need for a compassionate understanding of mental illness. While his actions were criminal and horrifying, they were also the result of complex psychological disturbances. His case illustrates the intersection of trauma, social isolation, and mental pathology, providing lessons about prevention, early intervention, and the ethical responsibilities of communities, families, and mental health systems. Researchers continue to examine his case to better understand how early life experiences, parental influence, and psychological disorders can contribute to extreme behavior. Even within the institution, Gein remained a figure of intense interest. Psychologists documented his behavior, noting both his compliance and the persistence of his compulsive thoughts. He was considered unlikely to pose a threat under supervision, yet the legacy of his actions remained palpable. Scholars studying his case emphasized the importance of understanding the context of criminal behavior, highlighting that severe pathology can develop in individuals who experience prolonged trauma, isolation, and inadequate social support. By examining Gein's confinement, we gain a clearer perspective on the broader societal and psychological implications of his life. His story is not only about the crimes themselves but also about the failures and limitations of the systems around him: family, community, mental health care, and law enforcement. The lessons derived from his life encourage reflection on how society identifies at-risk individuals, addresses severe psychological disturbance, and balances justice with treatment. Gein's life serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences of neglect and the importance of early intervention in cases of extreme pathology. In conclusion, the second phase of Ed Gein's life, his time in the mental institution, provides critical insight into the management of extreme psychological disturbance. While his crimes were horrifying, his confinement and study offer lessons about the intersections of trauma, mental illness, and criminal behavior. Gein's case remains a pivotal example in forensic psychology, emphasizing the importance of understanding both the individual and systemic factors that contribute to extreme actions. By examining this period of his life, we gain perspective not only on Gein himself but also on the broader responsibilities of society to prevent and address severe pathology before it manifests in destructive ways. As the years passed in confinement, Ed Gein's life at the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, settled into a routine of strict structure and limited freedom. While the horrors of his past crimes had captured public attention, the reality of his daily existence was far quieter, though no less significant for understanding the nature of his pathology and the broader societal implications of his life. For Gein, the hospital provided safety from his own compulsions and a controlled environment where he could no longer act upon his disturbing impulses. Yet this period also offered a lens through which psychologists, criminologists, and the public could examine the interplay between mental illness, trauma, and criminality. In the institution, Gein's days followed a rigid schedule designed to mitigate risk. Staff closely monitored his behavior, providing tasks, chores, and structured activities intended to engage his attention while preventing access to situations that could trigger compulsions. While some patients thrived under such structured routines, Gein's underlying psychological issues persisted. He exhibited continued fascination with death, his mother's influence, and morbid obsessions, though these thoughts were contained within the institution's controlled environment. Regular psychiatric evaluations documented these tendencies, allowing researchers to study how extreme psychological pathology interacts with isolation, structure, and supervision. Psychologists and psychiatrists remained deeply interested in Gein's mental state, viewing him as a case study of extreme criminal pathology intertwined with severe mental illness. His childhood had been marked by trauma, a domineering mother, exposure to strict religious dogma, and significant social isolation. Experts noted that these early experiences likely contributed to his detachment from societal norms and his morbid fascination with death. They argued that his actions were not merely the result of personal choice but were influenced by a lifetime of environmental, familial, and psychological factors. His case became a crucial example for forensic psychology, demonstrating how early experiences and untreated psychological disorders can manifest in extreme behaviors. During this period, Gein's notoriety continued outside the institution, fueled by media coverage, books, and growing public fascination with criminal psychology. Journalists and authors sought to uncover every detail of his life, while filmmakers began to draw inspiration from his story. Characters in horror films, from Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, were influenced by elements of his life: the isolated farmhouse, the morbid fascination with the dead, and the profound psychological disturbances rooted in his upbringing. While these adaptations were fictionalized, they reflected society's attempt to grapple with the unsettling reality of human deviance and the psychological underpinnings of violence. Despite this attention, Gein's own existence remained largely inward-looking. He rarely engaged with the public or even with the media that sought to study him. Letters and occasional interviews indicated that he was aware of his notoriety, but he maintained a degree of detachment. Psychologists interpreted this as consistent with his lifelong pattern of social isolation and compulsive behavior. Though he had committed acts that shocked and horrified, his life in confinement was one of observation and containment, demonstrating the ways in which society could limit harm while also attempting to understand extreme criminal behavior. The years in the institution also allowed for the continued documentation of Gein's psychological condition. Researchers observed that, while he complied with rules and routines, he continued to express an enduring obsession with his mother and the deceased. These obsessions were not fleeting, they remained persistent and central to his thought patterns, suggesting that his pathology was deeply ingrained. Such findings contributed to broader discussions in psychology about the long-term impact of childhood trauma, the role of obsessive-compulsive and psychotic disorders in criminal behavior, and the challenges of rehabilitation for individuals with severe mental illness. Ed Gein's story during this period is also significant in the context of legal and ethical considerations regarding the treatment of criminally insane individuals. While his confinement protected the public and prevented further criminal acts, it also raised questions about the extent to which society can or should attempt to rehabilitate individuals with deeply rooted psychological disturbances. Ethical considerations emerged around autonomy, informed consent, and the balance between care and control. Gein's case demonstrated that mental illness can complicate traditional notions of punishment and justice, highlighting the need for systems that protect both the individual and society. Beyond his psychiatric treatment, Gein's life in the hospital remained a point of reflection for the community of Plainfield and beyond. Residents continued to grapple with the shock of discovering that a seemingly ordinary neighbor had committed such extraordinary crimes. The case prompted questions about the role of social isolation, community oversight, and early intervention in preventing extreme criminal behavior. Local authorities and social workers began to study the warning signs evident in Gein's life, exploring ways that similar tragedies might be prevented in the future through education, awareness, and support for vulnerable individuals. Gein's continuing presence in public discourse also prompted reflection on media ethics and societal fascination with crime. The sensational nature of his story, his grave robbing, morbid artifacts, and murders, made him a subject of intense scrutiny. Media coverage often straddled the line between informative reporting and sensationalism, raising questions about the responsibilities of journalists and authors when covering real-life criminal behavior. Documentaries, books, and films took different approaches. Some emphasized the horror, while others sought to provide psychological and societal context. These portrayals helped shape public understanding of the complexities behind criminal acts, encouraging deeper consideration of causality, mental illness, and systemic failure. In the institution, Gein's interactions with staff and fellow patients offered insight into the day-to-day management of individuals with extreme pathology. Staff members noted his compliance, his peculiar behaviors, and his persistent fixations. While he was not violent within the hospital, his thoughts and prior actions provided ongoing learning opportunities for psychologists. They used his case to better understand the intersection of trauma, compulsive behavior, and social isolation. Each observation contributed to a growing body of knowledge about forensic psychology, mental health treatment, and the ethical management of criminally insane individuals. Even as he aged, Gein's life remained marked by the consequences of his early experiences. The physical and psychological effects of isolation, compounded by lifelong pathology, underscored the enduring nature of his disorders. Mental health professionals studied him as an example of how untreated psychological issues, when combined with environmental and social factors, can culminate in behaviors that shock the broader society. His life continued to be a reference point in discussions about the prevention of severe pathology, the role of early intervention, and the importance of supportive family and community structures. Ed Gein's story during these years also highlights the importance of understanding the human aspects behind criminal acts. While his crimes were monstrous, his continued existence in a controlled environment emphasized that extreme pathology can be contained and studied without further harm. This period of his life underscores the dual role of forensic institutions. They protect the public while providing opportunities for research and understanding, contributing to the prevention of similar tragedies in the future. Gein's life in the institution was marked by observation, study, and reflection. While removed from the horrors of his crimes, he remained a living example of the complex interplay between trauma, mental illness, and criminality. His confinement allowed society to learn more about the conditions that produce extreme behavior and the ways in which structured environments can mitigate risk while promoting understanding. The lessons derived from this period extend beyond his individual case, offering insight into forensic psychology, criminal justice, and the ethical treatment of individuals whose actions have profoundly affected society. Ed Gein's time in the mental institution highlights the ongoing struggle to understand and manage extreme criminal behavior. His life during these years offers valuable insights into the psychological, social, and ethical dimensions of confinement for the criminally insane. While the horrors of his past crimes remain unforgettable, his subsequent existence demonstrates the importance of structure, supervision, and careful study in managing individuals with severe psychological disturbances. His case continues to inform forensic practice, media representation, and societal reflection, ensuring that lessons are drawn from both the tragedy and the responses it provoked. As Ed Gein grew older, his life in the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane became increasingly shaped by the effects of age, health decline, and the passage of time. Though the world outside had long moved on from the shock of his crimes, his presence continued to command attention in psychological and cultural discussions. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the focus on Gein shifted slightly from the immediate horror of his actions to the broader questions they raised about the human mind, trauma, and societal responsibility. The quiet, controlled life he led inside the institution provided an ongoing study in the consequences of early trauma and extreme mental illness, revealing both the containment successes and the limitations of mid-20th century psychiatric care. Physically, Gein's health began to decline during this period, as is natural with advancing age. Staff at the hospital noted changes in his mobility, energy levels, and overall physical condition. While these factors did not alter the psychological underpinnings of his behavior, they did influence his daily routines. Tasks and chores were adjusted to accommodate his declining stamina, and medical attention became an increasing part of his institutional life. The interplay between physical decline and persistent mental pathology offered an additional layer of observation for psychologists, allowing them to examine how aging affects individuals with severe psychiatric disorders and long-standing compulsions. Psychologically, Gein remained a fascinating, if troubling, subject for researchers. His obsessions with death, corpses, and his mother's memory continued, though they were constrained by the structured environment of the hospital. He maintained some social interaction with staff and occasional visitors, though these relationships were limited by both his pathology and the rules of confinement. Experts observed that his compulsive behaviors had become ingrained and ritualized, illustrating how deep-seated psychological disturbances, if left untreated over decades, can become lifelong patterns. Gein's mental state reinforced earlier assessments that his condition was chronic, shaped by trauma and social isolation, and resistant to traditional therapeutic interventions of the time. During this period, cultural attention surrounding Gein intensified in certain circles. Filmmakers, writers, and journalists increasingly drew inspiration from elements of his life, crafting stories and characters that explored human psychology and horror. The archetypal, horror villain, in American cinema, disconnected, socially isolated, and psychologically twisted, was heavily influenced by aspects of Gein's life. Characters like Norman Bates from Psycho and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre were not literal representations of Gein but borrowed from his reality: the haunted farmhouse, the morbid fascinations, and the deeply disturbed relationship with maternal figures. These portrayals allowed audiences to explore fear, fascination, and the psychology of violence while simultaneously creating a distance from the real-life horrors he had committed. Despite this outward cultural fascination, Gein's inner life remained largely private and undisturbed. Staff noted that he could be cooperative, compliant, and even pleasant in conversation at times, though his personality was often overshadowed by the obsessions that had defined him for decades. He displayed occasional moments of reflection, sometimes expressing awareness of the notoriety he had gained, though these insights did not fundamentally alter his mental state. Psychologists studying him saw this as further evidence of the chronic and entrenched nature of his psychological disturbances, illustrating how early life trauma can have lifelong consequences if not addressed through intervention, therapy, or supportive social structures. Gein's story continued to raise broader questions about societal responsibility. Many observers reflected on the failures that contributed to his development, including his isolation, his mother's domineering influence, and the lack of early social support or mental health intervention. In professional and academic discussions, Gein was often cited as an example of how early exposure to trauma, neglect, and abnormal socialization can culminate in extreme behavior. His case became a reference point for those seeking to understand the intersection of environmental factors, mental illness, and criminal behavior. These discussions emphasized prevention, early intervention, and the importance of societal structures that protect vulnerable individuals before they develop harmful compulsions. During these years, Gein also became a subject of ongoing media interest. Journalists and authors sought new angles to explore, whether through psychological analysis, ethical debates about criminal responsibility, or reflections on the rural environment in which he grew up. Local communities, particularly those in Plainfield and surrounding areas, remained haunted by his story. Though the physical horror had long passed, the memory of his crimes and the discussion surrounding his life persisted as a cautionary tale. Residents often reflected on the signs that had been missed, the social isolation that allowed his behavior to go unchecked, and the disturbing normalcy he had maintained in everyday life prior to his arrest. The mental institution itself played a critical role in shaping Gein's later life. Staff members developed routines and therapeutic strategies that prioritized containment and observation while providing limited engagement to maintain basic social functioning. These strategies were informed by evolving psychiatric understanding but remained rooted in mid-20th century methods that emphasized supervision over transformative therapy. Observations of Gein's behavior during this time contributed to broader understanding in forensic psychology, particularly regarding long-term management of criminally insane individuals and the ethical considerations of such confinement. In addition to professional and academic attention, Gein's story continued to spark ethical debates in popular discourse. Some argued that his confinement represented both a protection for society and a form of ethical treatment for a profoundly disturbed individual. Others questioned whether the extreme psychological and social failures in his early life should have resulted in more proactive intervention, potentially preventing his descent into violence. The tension between justice, public safety, and humane treatment remained central to discussions of his life, providing ongoing lessons for legal systems, mental health practitioners, and society at large. As Gein aged, his notoriety was both a burden and a point of fascination. He lived out the remainder of his life under strict supervision, physically constrained by age and psychological management, yet intellectually and psychologically studied by professionals seeking to understand the roots of his behavior. His life demonstrated the persistence of pathological compulsions and the profound impact of early trauma, highlighting both the successes and limitations of the institutional response. In many ways, his story illustrates the enduring complexity of human behavior, the ways environmental, psychological, and social factors intertwine, creating patterns that can lead to extreme outcomes when left unaddressed. Culturally, Gein's influence persisted, though it evolved. The horrors of his crimes had inspired fictionalized accounts that allowed society to engage with fear, mortality, and deviance in a controlled context. At the same time, professionals used his case to develop deeper insights into forensic psychology, criminal pathology, and the treatment of mentally ill offenders. His life became a cautionary tale not only for what he did but for the systemic gaps that enabled him to act, the psychological vulnerabilities that went unnoticed, and the societal responsibilities that were neglected. The middle years of Ed Gein's institutional life provide a lens through which we can examine the intersection of aging, mental illness, and societal responsibility. His declining physical health, ongoing psychological obsessions, and continued cultural influence all underscore the complexity of his existence. While the immediate terror of his actions had receded, the lessons from his life, about trauma, pathology, and the human capacity for both horror and adaptation, remained deeply relevant. By studying this phase of his life, society gained insight into how mental illness can manifest over decades, how institutions manage extreme cases, and how culture processes the legacies of notorious figures. As the decades progressed, Ed Gein's life in the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane became defined by routine, structure, and the inescapable weight of his notoriety. Though the initial shock of his crimes had faded from headlines, the fascination with his story persisted, both in academic circles and popular culture. By the 1970s and 1980s, Gein was no longer simply a criminal. He had become a symbol of the profound consequences of psychological trauma, social isolation, and systemic neglect. His existence provided a living case study for psychiatrists, criminologists, and sociologists seeking to understand the intersection of mental illness and extreme behavior. Inside the hospital, Gein's days were carefully managed. Staff created a structured environment aimed at limiting stressors that might trigger compulsive behaviors, while simultaneously providing opportunities for engagement and observation. He performed tasks such as laundry, cleaning, and small maintenance duties, which allowed him to contribute to the institution, while also maintaining the rigid routines that helped stabilize his mental state. Psychologists monitored these activities to assess his behavior, noting that while he remained compliant and quiet, his thoughts were consistently dominated by morbid fascinations, particularly relating to death, the human body, and memories of his mother. Psychological assessments conducted during this period reinforced earlier diagnoses, Gein exhibited severe personality disorders and obsessive-compulsive tendencies, compounded by a history of trauma and social deprivation. While his outward behavior in the controlled environment was often calm, internally, he continued to struggle with compulsions and fantasies that had characterized much of his life. Researchers observed that, despite decades of containment and treatment, his core psychological patterns remained largely unchanged. This persistence underscored the difficulty of rehabilitating individuals with long-standing pathological behaviors rooted in early life experiences. The passage of time also brought physical changes. Aging compounded the challenges of his mental state. As mobility decreased, stamina waned, and minor illnesses became more frequent. These physical limitations further reduced his ability to engage with the external world or act on compulsions, effectively reinforcing the containment measures already in place. Staff adjusted his routines accordingly, balancing the need for continued observation with accommodations for his declining health. Medical professionals noted that while aging mitigated some risk behaviors, it did not fundamentally alter the psychological tendencies that had made Gein infamous. Public fascination with Gein evolved alongside his aging. By the 1970s, the initial wave of shock and horror had given way to a more complex cultural engagement with his story. Books, documentaries, and films drew inspiration from his life, portraying elements of his psychological profile while crafting fictionalized narratives that explored horror, trauma, and deviance. Characters such as Norman Bates in Psycho and Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre were influenced by aspects of Gein's history, his isolation, obsessive behaviors, and macabre interest in corpses. These adaptations allowed audiences to engage with fear in a safe, fictionalized context, while also indirectly grappling with deeper questions about human behavior, morality, and mental illness. Scholars and criminologists continued to study Gein's case in depth. His life provided insights into the complex interplay of nature, nurture, and circumstance. Experts highlighted the impact of his traumatic childhood, dominated by an abusive and controlling mother, and the isolation of rural life, which left him socially disconnected. These factors, combined with undiagnosed or untreated mental illness, created conditions that allowed his compulsions to manifest in extreme ways. Gein's institutional life offered a unique opportunity to study the long-term effects of such compounded influences on behavior, particularly in cases where early intervention had failed or was unavailable. Throughout this period, ethical considerations regarding his confinement remained a topic of discussion. Gein's continued presence in the institution ensured public safety and allowed for psychological study, but it also raised questions about autonomy, dignity, and the balance between treatment and containment. The challenge of caring for a person with severe mental illness, particularly one with a history of violent criminal acts, highlighted the ethical complexities inherent in psychiatric and legal systems. Professionals debated the extent to which he could benefit from treatment, the responsibilities of society to protect both him and the public, and the limits of institutional care in addressing deeply ingrained pathology. Gein's interactions with staff and fellow patients were closely monitored, revealing both compliance and lingering psychological disturbances. While he was nonviolent within the institution, he occasionally exhibited behaviors that reflected his ongoing obsessions, such as drawing morbid sketches or discussing macabre topics. Staff interpreted these behaviors as evidence of the persistent compulsions that had defined much of his life. These observations contributed to a broader understanding of criminal pathology, particularly regarding how extreme compulsions can remain entrenched even when external risk factors are minimized. During these years, the media maintained intermittent interest in Gein's story. Newspapers and magazines revisited the case, often in the context of broader discussions about criminal psychology, mental health treatment, and the cultural fascination with horror. Ethical debates emerged regarding the sensationalization of real-life crime, particularly as Gein's story continued to inspire fictional adaptations. Scholars and journalists questioned how much focus should be placed on his notoriety versus understanding the psychological and social factors that led to his crimes. These discussions helped shape the evolving discourse around media responsibility, criminal justice, and mental health ethics. Gein's aging also highlighted the importance of the institutional environment in preventing further harm. His confinement effectively neutralized the risk of recidivism, demonstrating the role of controlled settings in managing individuals with severe psychological disturbances. At the same time, his case underscored that containment alone does not address underlying pathology. While Gein remained physically safe and socially removed from society, his mental obsessions persisted, emphasizing the limits of institutional care and the enduring nature of certain psychological disorders. As the 1980s approached, Gein's story continued to resonate both academically and culturally. Researchers used his life as a case study to explore topics such as the effects of isolation, trauma, and mental illness on human behavior. His narrative offered lessons in prevention, intervention, and the long-term management of individuals whose actions have extreme societal consequences. At the same time, popular culture maintained a fascination with the horror house elements of his story, often blurring the line between fact and fiction. These dual narratives, academic and cultural, ensured that Gein's legacy remained relevant decades after his crimes. In sum, Ed Gein's later years at the Central State Hospital illustrate the complexity of managing severe psychological disorders in individuals with a history of extreme criminal behavior. Aging, institutional structure, and societal fascination all intersected to define this period of his life. While the immediate terror of his crimes had long passed, the lessons drawn from his ongoing existence remained significant. The enduring impact of trauma, the challenges of rehabilitation, the ethical responsibilities of society, and the ways in which culture processes the legacies of notorious figures. Gein's story in these years offers a window into both human pathology and the broader social and ethical considerations it invokes, ensuring that his life, while tragic and disturbing, continues to inform discussions in psychology, criminology, and society at large. As Ed Gein entered the final phase of his life, the patterns that had defined his existence became increasingly evident. The rhythms of institutional life, the strict schedules, the limited interactions, and the containment measures designed to prevent further harm, continued to dominate his daily routine. Gein's physical health, naturally, was deteriorating with age, and his once capable frame became frail and slower. The effects of decades in confinement, combined with the natural progression of aging, reinforced the need for medical supervision, and his daily life became a delicate balance between maintaining stability and managing his physical decline. The hospital staff carefully monitored him, ensuring that he could continue performing basic tasks while keeping the environment safe for both Gein and those around him. Despite his advancing age, the psychological dimensions of his life remained largely unchanged. Gein's compulsions and obsessions, rooted in his traumatic upbringing, social isolation, and long-standing mental illness, persisted, though they were mostly contained by the structure of the institution. Staff observed him continuing rituals and repetitive behaviors, a reminder of how deeply ingrained his pathology had become. Even in a controlled environment, the patterns of thought that had contributed to his criminal acts decades earlier persisted, offering a sobering view of the challenges faced by forensic psychologists when attempting to address chronic and deeply rooted mental disturbances. Over the years, Gein became a subject not only of clinical study but also of ongoing cultural fascination. By the 1980s, the true breadth of his influence on horror fiction and popular media was becoming evident. Authors, filmmakers, and screenwriters continued to draw inspiration from the elements of his life: the isolated farmhouse, the obsession with human remains, and the psychological complexities born of extreme childhood experiences. Characters and narratives inspired by Gein explored fear, morality, and human psychology, allowing audiences to examine horror in a safe, controlled manner while still grappling with the disturbing realities his life represented. Films like Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had already been released, but Gein's story continued to influence creators, and his notoriety ensured that his legacy remained a touchstone for discussions of true crime, horror, and psychological pathology. Gein's interactions within the institution continued to be instructive for psychologists and criminologists. He was compliant with staff, capable of conversation, and occasionally engaged in tasks or social interactions though these were always framed by his underlying pathology. Observers noted that he could maintain a veneer of normalcy, masking the obsessive and often morbid thoughts that persisted beneath the surface. This duality, the outwardly functional individual whose mind remained consumed by compulsions, was a focal point of study, revealing the complex interplay between socialization, containment, and mental illness. The contrast between Gein's controlled institutional behavior and the extremes of his past actions provided critical insights into the long-term management of high-risk individuals with severe psychological disturbances. As time passed, the ethical considerations surrounding his continued confinement became more pronounced. Questions arose about the balance between safety, treatment, and autonomy. Gein's life underscored the tension inherent in housing individuals who are both severely mentally ill and historically dangerous. While confinement protected the public, it also highlighted the limited avenues for rehabilitation. Ethical debates considered whether the decades of containment could be regarded as a form of care, punishment, or simply societal necessity. The discussions surrounding Gein's ongoing institutional life reflected broader societal challenges in addressing chronic criminal behavior intertwined with mental illness, illustrating the delicate balance required in forensic psychiatry. During this period, media interest persisted, though it had shifted from sensational reporting to more nuanced exploration of the man behind the crimes. Journalists, authors, and documentarians examined the broader social and psychological factors that contributed to his actions. Analyses frequently focused on the role of his childhood, dominated by an authoritarian and abusive mother, isolation in rural Wisconsin, and exposure to rigid religious doctrines, as well as the lack of early interventions that might have prevented his descent into pathological behaviors. These explorations contributed to public understanding of the importance of early childhood environments, social support systems, and the role of mental health care in preventing extreme outcomes. Cultural fascination with Gein also intersected with discussions of morality and ethics. His life story prompted questions about human nature, the roots of criminality, and society's responsibility to vulnerable individuals. Academics used his case to illustrate the impact of early trauma and social deprivation, while filmmakers and writers continued to explore the horror of human psychology. In both arenas, Gein's life became more than a criminal record. It became a lens through which society could explore uncomfortable truths about the mind, morality, and the thin line between normality and pathology. Despite the passage of time, Gein maintained a limited connection to the outside world. He was occasionally visited by journalists or researchers seeking first-hand insights, and these encounters revealed a man who had settled into the routines of institutional life. He was cooperative but reserved, often deflecting questions about his past or providing sparse, matter-of-fact answers. These interactions offered glimpses into his thought processes, illustrating the complexities of his psyche and the enduring effects of his formative experiences. Psychologists noted that while Gein could articulate aspects of his behavior and experiences, these reflections did not diminish the compulsive patterns that had governed his life. In addition to psychological study, Gein's life continued to inform legal and ethical discussions. His case became a reference point in debates over the treatment of criminally insane individuals, the ethics of confinement, and the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Scholars examined how societal failures, ranging from neglectful parenting to inadequate social services, contributed to his development, and how the legal system addressed the consequences of his actions. Gein's prolonged institutionalization exemplified the challenges inherent in balancing public safety, ethical care, and human dignity, raising questions that remain relevant in contemporary forensic and psychiatric practice. Over time, the community around Plainfield, Wisconsin, remained aware of Gein's enduring presence in the hospital. While he no longer posed a threat to the local population, the memory of his crimes lingered. Residents often reflected on the signs that had been missed, the isolation that had shaped his early life, and the stark reality that extraordinary pathology can remain hidden in plain sight. Gein's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the potential consequences of neglect, social isolation, and untreated mental illness. His existence served as both a local memory and a broader societal lesson, influencing discourse around public safety and mental health interventions. In his final years at the institution, Gein's daily life became increasingly shaped by both age and routine. He required additional medical attention and adapted to the limitations imposed by declining mobility. Staff continued to observe him carefully, documenting behaviors and maintaining the structured environment necessary to prevent risk. While his external actions remained largely nonviolent and controlled, his mental landscape continued to reflect the obsessions and compulsions that had defined much of his life. These years reinforced the understanding that certain psychological disturbances, when deeply ingrained and compounded by early trauma, can persist for a lifetime, resistant to rehabilitation or intervention. The lasting impact of Gein's story extended far beyond the walls of the institution. His life informed ongoing discussions in criminology, psychology, law, and ethics. By studying his experiences, professionals gained insight into the origins of extreme criminal behavior, the effects of isolation and trauma, and the challenges of managing individuals with entrenched pathological tendencies. Culturally, his narrative continued to inspire exploration in literature, film, and art, ensuring that the fascination with Gein's life and mind would endure across generations. Through these final decades, Ed Gein's existence reflected both the personal consequences of a deeply disturbed mind and the societal challenges of addressing severe mental illness in individuals who have committed extreme crimes. His life served as a lens through which to examine ethics, psychology, and culture, illustrating the enduring interplay between trauma, pathology, and human behavior. While the immediate horror of his actions had long faded, the lessons embedded in his life remained potent, offering insight into the complexities of morality, mental health, and the human capacity for both darkness and adaptation. As Ed Gein moved further into the later stages of his life, his presence in the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane became a fixture of routine, observation, and cultural curiosity. Time had diminished the immediacy of fear associated with his crimes, yet the fascination with his life persisted both within professional circles and in the broader public imagination. His existence continued to offer insight into the long-term consequences of psychological trauma, social isolation, and untreated mental illness, making him a living case study for psychiatrists, criminologists, and social scientists. Gein's daily life was largely shaped by the rhythm of institutional structure. Staff monitored his health, managed his medication, and maintained strict routines to prevent the resurgence of compulsive behaviors that had defined his early life. Physical decline was apparent, his movements were slower, his stamina limited, and his frailty made it necessary for the staff to adjust his activities to ensure both safety and engagement. Even as his body weakened, however, the patterns of thought and obsession that had characterized his earlier years remained, contained but persistent. Gein's compulsions and morbid fascinations were mitigated by the controlled environment, but they were never fully extinguished. During these years, his interactions with staff and visitors were deliberate and measured. He exhibited compliance and a subdued demeanor, yet occasionally, glimpses of his former preoccupations surfaced in conversations, sketches, or observations of the hospital grounds. Psychologists took careful note of these behaviors, using them to deepen understanding of entrenched compulsions and the enduring effects of trauma on adult behavior. They observed that while containment could prevent external harm, it could not entirely reshape internal psychological patterns, particularly those rooted in childhood experiences and reinforced over decades. The cultural fascination with Gein's life continued to evolve. By the 1980s and 1990s, his story had become a touchstone for discussions in horror fiction, true crime, and media ethics. Filmmakers, authors, and artists drew inspiration from elements of his life, often blending fact and fiction to explore deeper psychological themes. His isolated farmhouse, obsession with human remains, and the extreme consequences of social and familial neglect became motifs in a growing number of works. While these portrayals sometimes sensationalized the more lurid aspects of his life, they also offered a space for society to explore fear, morality, and the boundaries of human behavior in a controlled, imaginative context. Psychologists studying Gein emphasized the importance of understanding him as a product of complex social, familial, and psychological influences. His upbringing had been dominated by an authoritarian mother who instilled rigid religious beliefs, social isolation, and a sense of fear and shame. Early experiences of neglect, exposure to mortality, and the lack of normal social interaction created fertile ground for the obsessions and compulsions that emerged in adulthood. Researchers noted that these factors, combined with undiagnosed mental illness, explained much about the trajectory of his life and behaviors without excusing the harm he caused. As time passed, ethical considerations regarding his confinement and treatment gained renewed attention. Discussions in academic and professional circles examined the balance between public safety, care for the mentally ill, and the ethical responsibility to provide humane treatment. Gein's case became a prominent example of the challenges involved in managing individuals who have committed violent acts due to deep-seated psychological disturbances. The need for continued containment was clear, but so too was the necessity of treating him with dignity and providing opportunities for engagement, reflection, and controlled autonomy. His later years also highlighted the limitations of rehabilitation for certain pathological conditions. While structured routines and a controlled environment minimized the risk of harm, they could not address the deeply ingrained psychological patterns that had developed over decades. Gein's compulsions, obsessions, and fixation on death and human remains persisted, albeit in a mitigated form. These observations reinforce the idea that some individuals with severe and chronic mental illness may never fully integrate into society, and that long-term management requires a careful balance of containment, treatment, and ethical oversight. During this period, media attention on Gein shifted from sensational reporting to more analytical and reflective approaches. Documentaries, books, and journalistic accounts began to focus on the societal, familial, and psychological contexts that had shaped his life. Authors explored the intersections of trauma, isolation, and mental illness, seeking to understand how a man living in rural Wisconsin could evolve into a figure whose actions shocked a nation. These examinations emphasized the importance of preventive intervention, community awareness, and mental health support, suggesting that understanding the roots of criminal behavior is essential in mitigating future tragedies. Within the hospital, Gein's interactions with other patients remained limited. His isolation was maintained both for his own safety and for the protection of others, as well as to prevent the reinforcement of compulsive behaviors through social exposure. Psychologists observed that his preference for solitude was consistent with patterns established during his youth and early adulthood. This preference for isolation reflected both psychological necessity and habitual behavior, highlighting the long-term impact of early life conditions on adult social functioning. Despite the controlled environment, Gein occasionally displayed a fascination with human anatomy and mortality. These interests manifested in nonviolent ways, such as collecting anatomical books, reading about historical forensic cases, or discussing historical events involving death. Staff interpreted these behaviors as remnants of earlier obsessions, and while they were never acted upon, they offered a window into the persistence of deeply rooted psychological tendencies. Scholars used these observations to explore the nature of compulsion, obsession, and the ways in which individuals can live within society when their impulses are redirected or contained. As Gein aged, the hospital adapted his care to accommodate both his physical and psychological needs. He received increased medical attention for age-related conditions, and staff continued to observe his behavior to ensure that his mental state remained stable. This period of his life demonstrated the importance of long-term planning and individualized care for individuals with severe psychological disturbances, particularly those who had engaged in extreme criminal acts. Gein's continued survival in this structured environment emphasized the role of containment, routine, and professional oversight in managing the ongoing risks associated with chronic pathology. Culturally, Gein's story continued to resonate. His life served as a source of inspiration for discussions on criminal psychology, ethical treatment of mentally ill offenders, and the broader societal responsibility to intervene in cases of early trauma and neglect. Fictional portrayals, while often dramatized, provided a mechanism for audiences to grapple with fear, morality, and the consequences of extreme isolation and psychological disturbance. Scholars and journalists alike noted the delicate balance required in addressing the line between factual recounting and cultural interpretation, particularly when real victims and their families were affected. Through the late stages of his life, Gein became both a subject of continued study and a symbol of broader societal lessons. His case illustrated the consequences of untreated trauma, the challenges of rehabilitation, and the complex ethical terrain of institutionalization. Researchers, legal experts, and cultural commentators drew from his experiences to explore questions of morality, mental health, and social responsibility. Gein's life remained a reference point, demonstrating that even decades after violent acts, individuals can continue to provide insight into the intersection of psychology, ethics, and culture. By the end of this period, it was evident that while Gein's physical presence had become quiet and contained, the implications of his life were still far-reaching. His existence challenged assumptions about human behavior, criminality, and the potential for intervention. Academics continued to analyze his case, filmmakers continued to draw inspiration, and society continued to grapple with the moral and ethical questions it raised. The enduring fascination with Gein underscored a collective desire to understand the dark corners of human psychology while learning lessons about prevention, care, and the consequences of neglect. In these later decades, Ed Gein's life demonstrated the intersection of pathology, containment, and cultural resonance. While the immediate fear of his crimes had long passed, the lessons from his existence remained salient: the enduring impact of trauma, the complexities of mental illness, and the societal responsibility to protect both vulnerable individuals and the broader community. Gein's story in this phase of life continued to inform discussions in psychology, criminology, and ethics, ensuring that his legacy, though tragic and disturbing, remained relevant and instructive for generations seeking to understand the interplay of human behavior. As Ed Gein moved further into the twilight of his life, the passage of time allowed for a more reflective understanding of both the man and the societal conditions that had shaped him. The decades of institutionalization had stabilized his external behavior, and while his compulsions and morbid fascinations remained contained, they no longer posed the same immediate threat to the outside world. Psychologists, criminologists, and medical staff continued to monitor him carefully, but there was also a sense that Gein had entered a phase defined less by daily chaos and more by the slow passage of time, observation, and the subtle unfolding of a long life marked by tragedy and pathology. In these later years, much attention shifted to the ethical and moral implications of Gein's confinement. Scholars debated whether decades spent in a secure hospital had been, in effect, a life sentence under the guise of care, or whether it had provided the only viable option for a man whose psychological disturbances were so deeply ingrained. Discussions in forensic psychology emphasized the balance between containment, treatment, and human dignity, particularly for individuals whose crimes were fueled by early trauma and chronic mental illness. Gein's life demonstrated the difficulty of achieving rehabilitation when a person's pathology is both severe and lifelong, underscoring the limitations of therapeutic interventions in such cases. Daily life for Gein continued under strict routines. Staff members carefully structured his day with meals, limited recreational activities, and medical oversight. Despite the monotony, these routines were essential in maintaining his stability and preventing resurgence of behaviors that had been dangerous in his past. While there were no further criminal acts, his interactions with staff occasionally revealed glimpses into the ongoing struggles within his mind. Conversations might circle around morbid topics, his interest in anatomy, or historical accounts of death and forensics. These moments reinforced the depth of his psychological fixations and the long-lasting impact of his traumatic upbringing and isolation. Gein's presence in academic and cultural discussions remained significant. His life had become a case study in extreme criminal psychology, illustrating how childhood trauma, social isolation, and untreated mental illness can converge to produce violent and aberrant behavior. In forensic psychology courses, criminology studies, and ethical debates, his story served as an illustrative example of the complexity of human behavior. Scholars explored how early interventions, social support, and mental health care might have altered the trajectory of his life, often using Gein as a lens to consider how society might prevent similar outcomes in others. By this point, public fascination with Gein had evolved from shock to analysis. True crime writers, journalists, and documentarians increasingly examined his story with attention to the social and psychological factors underlying his crimes. Rather than merely sensationalizing his actions, these accounts sought to understand the interplay between his abusive upbringing, his mother's extreme religious influence, and the isolation of rural life. In doing so, they presented a more nuanced picture of a man whose crimes were horrifying but whose life reflected systemic failures that extended beyond his personal pathology. During his final years, the institution focused not only on containment, but also on maintaining his dignity. Gein was allowed limited access to books, writing materials, and structured interaction with staff, providing a semblance of normalcy within the highly controlled environment. Psychologists observed that while his obsessive thoughts and compulsions persisted internally, the structured environment prevented them from manifesting in harmful ways. This reinforced the importance of supervision, routine, and appropriate medical oversight in managing individuals with deeply ingrained pathological tendencies. Gein's life continued to raise questions about mental illness, culpability, and societal responsibility. Legal scholars debated how the justice system had addressed his case, noting the interplay between his documented insanity and the criminal acts he committed. Ethical discussions centered on the morality of confinement for life, particularly for someone whose crimes were rooted in deep psychological disturbances. Gein's situation highlighted the difficulty of balancing public safety with the treatment and rights of mentally ill offenders, a debate that continues in contemporary forensic practice. Cultural representations of Gein's life remained influential. Filmmakers, authors, and artists continued to draw inspiration from the details of his story, often exploring themes of fear, isolation, and the extremes of human psychology. While popular portrayals sometimes dramatized or sensationalized aspects of his life, they also facilitated broader conversations about the social and psychological factors that can lead to extreme criminal behavior. Gein became not just a figure of horror, but a symbol for examining the darker recesses of the human mind and the societal failures that contribute to such tragedies. During this period, the community around Plainfield, Wisconsin, maintained a quiet awareness of Gein's ongoing confinement. Locals remembered the fear his crimes had once evoked, and his continued presence in the hospital served as a reminder of both the extremes of human behavior and the importance of vigilance in recognizing warning signs. His life became a lens through which to explore the consequences of social neglect, isolation, and inadequate mental health care, offering lessons for communities, caregivers, and professionals alike. Gein's interactions with researchers and journalists became increasingly selective. He remained cooperative but reserved, often offering brief and matter-of-fact responses. These exchanges revealed a man who had adapted to institutional life, whose earlier compulsions were largely contained, yet whose inner world remained dominated by long-standing obsessions. Psychologists emphasized that understanding Gein's inner life was crucial not for sensationalism, but for gaining insight into the enduring effects of trauma and the complexities of managing individuals with severe psychopathology. By the late stages of his life, Gein's story had transcended the immediate horrors of his crimes. He became a figure through which society could examine questions of morality, psychology, and social responsibility. His experiences highlighted the consequences of neglect, the impact of trauma, and the challenges of managing deeply disturbed individuals within legal and medical frameworks. Researchers continued to study his life, not merely as a record of criminal behavior, but as a complex case that illuminated the intersections of environment, psychology, and societal response. Even as he aged, Gein remained a subject of academic inquiry. His case continued to inform discussions about ethical treatment, forensic evaluation, and the prevention of extreme criminal behavior. Scholars examined the interplay between his early life experiences, his psychological profile, and the social isolation that had contributed to his actions. Gein's continued presence in these discussions underscored the importance of understanding criminal behavior within a broader context of human development, societal influence, and mental health care. In summary, Ed Gein's later years were characterized by a delicate balance of containment, observation, and reflection. While the immediate danger he once posed had long passed, the lessons embedded in his life remained profoundly relevant. His existence provided ongoing insight into the long-term consequences of trauma, the challenges of managing chronic mental illness, and the societal responsibility to address vulnerabilities before they manifest in extreme behavior. Gein's story, though deeply tragic, continued to inform, educate, and challenge societal assumptions about human behavior, morality, and the intricate web of factors that shape a life marked by pathology. The final chapter of Ed Gein's life unfolded quietly, far from the sensationalized headlines that had once shocked the nation. His story, though rooted in acts that would forever mark him in criminal history, became less about fear and more about reflection, both on the man himself and on the broader societal factors that shaped his trajectory. As he aged within the confines of the Wisconsin mental health system, Gein's existence took on a dual role. He remained a subject of medical observation and analysis while simultaneously becoming a symbol for understanding the intersections of trauma, pathology, and societal responsibility. Gein's health in his later years declined gradually. Decades of institutionalization, along with the natural effects of aging, brought physical frailty and chronic conditions that required ongoing medical attention. Hospital staff adapted his care to accommodate these changes, ensuring that he remained stable, both physically and mentally. Even as his body weakened, his mind continued to reflect the patterns established over a lifetime, a fascination with mortality, an intense attachment to certain rituals, and obsessions rooted in early childhood trauma. While these tendencies no longer manifested in violent acts, they remained a persistent component of his internal world, demonstrating the enduring nature of deep-seated psychological disturbances. Throughout this period, Gein maintained a level of compliance and routine that allowed the hospital to manage his care effectively. Staff and psychologists noted that structure and supervision were critical to preventing behavioral regression or the resurfacing of compulsions. His days were filled with controlled activities, medical monitoring, and quiet observation, providing a stable environment in which risk to himself or others was minimized. This phase of his life highlighted the importance of long-term institutional care for individuals with severe psychological disorders, particularly when their early experiences had shaped complex, maladaptive behavioral patterns. The passage of time did not diminish the cultural fascination with Gein. Even decades after his crimes, his life continued to inspire discussions in criminology, psychology, literature, and film. Authors and researchers revisited the details of his upbringing, analyzing the impact of an abusive, controlling mother, extreme social isolation, and untreated mental illness. His life became a case study not only for understanding criminal behavior but also for exploring the broader ethical, moral, and societal questions surrounding mental health care, institutionalization, and the prevention of violence. Films, books, and other media often drew inspiration from the most sensational aspects of Gein's life, yet many creators also sought to humanize him, or at least provide context for his actions. Stories about his isolated farmhouse, his compulsions, and his peculiar rituals captured the public imagination, but they also served as a lens through which audiences could explore the consequences of neglect and trauma. These portrayals sometimes blurred the line between fact and fiction, but they consistently reinforced the broader themes of psychological distress, social isolation, and systemic failure that had defined Gein's life. Psychologists and criminologists used Gein's later years as an opportunity to examine the long-term effects of trauma and mental illness. His persistent obsessions and compulsions, even when safely contained, offered insight into the nature of chronic psychopathology. Researchers noted that early intervention, social support, and mental health care might have altered the course of his life, highlighting the critical importance of preventive measures and the societal responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals before they reach crisis points. Gein's existence thus became both a cautionary tale and a platform for academic exploration, emphasizing that understanding criminal behavior requires attention to both individual pathology and environmental context. During these years, ethical questions regarding his confinement and care continued to emerge. Scholars debated the morality of lifelong institutionalization, even when it ensured public safety, and considered how to balance the needs of society with the rights and dignity of mentally ill offenders. Gein's case illustrated the challenges inherent in managing individuals whose crimes were rooted in deep psychological disturbances, and it highlighted the difficulty of applying conventional notions of punishment and rehabilitation to such extreme cases. His life underscored the importance of a nuanced approach, one that considered mental health, societal protection, and ethical treatment simultaneously. Public perception of Gein shifted significantly over time. Initial reactions of shock and horror gradually gave way to fascination tempered by analysis and reflection. Society began to view him not merely as a monster but as a person whose life reflected profound failure in both family and community structures. Discussions in media, academia, and public forums increasingly emphasized the intersection of childhood trauma, isolation, and untreated mental illness, illustrating that his crimes, while abhorrent, were symptomatic of broader social issues. This shift did not excuse his actions but allowed for a more comprehensive understanding of the factors that led to them. Gein's interactions with staff, researchers, and occasional visitors became increasingly sparse as his health declined, but each encounter was carefully observed. Psychologists took note of his continued interest in mortality, his methodical routines, and his reflective moments, interpreting them as part of the complex mosaic of a life shaped by trauma and compulsion. These observations contributed to a growing body of research on chronic psychopathology, the management of dangerous individuals, and the long-term consequences of extreme social isolation. Gein's existence in these final years remained both a practical case for clinical study and a symbol of the enduring human fascination with the boundaries of morality, sanity, and societal responsibility. In addition to his institutional life, Gein's story continued to resonate in broader cultural and ethical discussions. Debates around media representation, sensationalism, and the balance between education and exploitation often referenced his case. Scholars and journalists explored how his life had been interpreted and reinterpreted over the decades, examining the tension between public fascination and the ethical responsibility to handle such stories with care. Gein's life, therefore, became a focal point for understanding not only criminal psychology but also the cultural and moral questions that arise when society confronts extreme human behavior. As the end of his life approached, Gein's continued confinement served as a reminder of the complexities inherent in managing individuals with severe psychological disorders who have committed violent acts. He remained alive within the controlled environment of the hospital, yet the lessons of his existence extended far beyond its walls. Psychologists, criminologists, and ethicists consistently pointed to his life as a case study in both the necessity and limitations of institutionalization, illustrating the enduring tension between containment, treatment, and societal protection. Finally, Ed Gein passed away quietly in the hospital, his death marking the end of a life that had long fascinated, horrified, and educated the public. While he had caused unimaginable fear during his early years, his later decades were spent under observation and care, revealing both the persistence of pathological behaviors and the possibility of living safely within structured environments. His story, spanning decades of both action and containment, left a lasting imprint on psychology, criminology, ethics, and popular culture. Gein's life continues to serve as a lens through which society examines the consequences of trauma, the challenges of mental illness, and the delicate balance between punishment, treatment, and human dignity. In death, as in life, Gein's legacy remains complex. He is remembered not only for the horrors of his crimes but also for the broader lessons his life offers: the consequences of neglect, the enduring impact of trauma, the necessity of careful institutional care, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in managing extreme psychopathology. His story continues to inform academic study, media interpretation, and public discourse, serving as a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of human psychology. Through careful reflection, analysis, and ethical consideration, Ed Gein's life provides enduring insights into the intricate intersections of crime, mental health, and society.